What's up guys, I'm Nico of CamCrunch, and in this video we're going to go through the different features and the different specs of cameras that you guys need to take note of when you're choosing your first camera. If you guys watched the last video, I talked about why you might want to wait off on buying your first camera when you're just starting off with photography and instead borrowing a camera and focus on learning the craft of photography rather than spending your time on trying to figure out which cameras to buy, which cameras to look at, and making that first plunge. But if you guys are already ready to buy your first camera, then this video is for you. So again, in this video we're going to go through the different specs, the different features that really make a camera good or better than other cameras. So if you guys find this video helpful, definitely give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't yet, and keep following along on the Photography for Beginners series. Now the first thing I want to talk about is resolution and megapixels. I'm going to talk about what this actually means, if it's important, why it's important, and things like that. Because when you guys see ads for cameras, the first thing that is sort of made bold is the megapixel count. You know, we'll say 60 megapixels, 20 megapixels, 24, 26, 30 megapixels. Now we even have cameras that are 45, 50 megapixels. So that's the sort of the number that a lot of camera manufacturers put in bold to attract people to buying their cameras, because in a lot of people's minds, more megapixels equals better. And in many cases that is true, but that's not always the case. To understand why megapixels is associated with being better, we have to go back to sort of the beginning of the digital camera era. When digital cameras first came out, you had very low resolution cameras. It started off being less than 1 megapixel. And 1 megapixel basically means 1,000 pixels. And if you think about that compared to the cameras now, that is extremely low resolution. That's lower resolution than the screens in most smartphones at this point. That's how low resolution those old cameras were, the first ones. So when camera manufacturers came out with new cameras with higher megapixels, 2 megapixels, 3 megapixels, that was something to boast about, because that meant more resolution, more detail in your shots. It didn't look as mushy as the first digital cameras that ever came out. And they would be clearer on screens, on computers, and especially when you printed out those photos. So that's sort of why megapixels are traditionally seen as something that makes a camera better. But like I said earlier, more megapixels can certainly mean a better camera. So let's talk about what megapixels and resolution actually do. So resolution is basically how much detail there is in the photo. It's how many pixels there are in the photo. And the more pixels there are, the more detail you have, the sharper your images can potentially be. And with that sharper, bigger image, you can do a lot of things. You can print photos a lot larger. So if you are a commercial photographer that does work that is going to be published in magazines, for example, and you want all that detail, or even more so if they're going to be printed out into large prints, billboards, things like that, you'll want more megapixels. If you guys are landscape photographers, let's say, and you really want to get all the detail of the scenery that you're capturing, more megapixels can help you out as well. There's some genres where megapixels don't necessarily matter. For example, a lot of sports photography these days, a lot of it just goes straight to the internet, and they're viewed on the internet. A lot of news is viewed on the internet. If that's the case and they're never going to be printed out very large, you still want a good amount of megapixels, but you don't need the behemoth of cameras that have like 40, 50 megapixels. You don't even need to come close to any of that if your photos aren't going to be printed anywhere large and just viewed through screens. So if you need that extra detail, megapixels are a good place to look at. But if you look at cameras today, most cameras have 16 or more megapixels. And I think 16 is a good baseline. If you have 16 megapixels, that's already so much detail. I think my first camera had 8 megapixels. That's how few megapixels it has. 16 is more than double and more than enough resolution for most people. So looking at megapixels depends on really what you plan to do with your camera. If you need that extra detail, then more megapixels can be good for you. But for most people, 16 megapixels is already a good baseline. That's already a good amount of megapixels to have. Now all of these different pixel counts all have their advantages and disadvantages. But some of you guys might be asking, why don't you just go for the higher megapixel count if you can, if it's available? Well, there are drawbacks as well. First things first is that larger megapixel cameras and larger megapixel sensors usually cost a little bit more. So if you guys see some cameras with different variants, and there's a low resolution variant and a high resolution variant, the higher resolution variant usually costs a little bit more. So that's one downside. The second downside is with file size. So with higher megapixels comes bigger file size, which means you need a little bit more processing power with your computer to process those raw files. Even the JPEG files are a little bit bigger. And another big downside, which brings me to my next point, is high ISO performance. Usually if you get two sensors of the same size, so let's say two full frame sensors compared to each other, one is 20 megapixels versus one that is 30 megapixels. If they are of the same technology, of the same generation, the one with the lower megapixel count will usually have better high ISO performance. That's because each individual pixel is a little bit bigger versus the smaller, more cramped pixels on the one with the more megapixels. And that usually just gives you better high ISO performance. Of course, there's a lot of science and technology that goes into that, but as a general rule, all you have to kind of know is that usually when you have less megapixels, less pixels in a sensor, it has better low light performance, given that both sensors are of equal technology and equal generation. And high ISO performance these days is pretty good with all cameras. So even your super high megapixel cameras are super good in low light situations. But if you guys need that extra bump in low light situations and you don't care for megapixels as much, then the high ISO performance with the lower megapixel count is something that you guys might want to reach for instead of that higher resolution camera. So far we've talked about resolution and we've talked about high ISO performance. And there's one more thing that affects sort of image quality, and that is your dynamic range. Dynamic range is basically how many values an image sensor can capture in between the darkest point and the lightest point. To easily describe this, think of a picture that you've captured where you might have shadows that are exposed nicely, but then when you look at the sky, or for example, it's a little bit blown out. It's like white and you can't see too much. Versus an image that maybe you've seen online or somewhere where you have so much detail in the shadows and you also have details on the highlights, on the skies and everything that's bright. That image with more detail in both the shadows and the highlights means it has more dynamic range. You get more values in between the darkest and the lightest point. Versus the one where you get either the shadows blown out or the highlights blown out or even both blown out. That camera or that image sensor doesn't have as much dynamic range. There's some clear winners in terms of dynamic range with the cameras right now. So you guys will have to do research on the individual cameras that you're looking at. When it comes to brands, there aren't brands that are necessarily the best or better than others. There are brands that do better than other brands in certain aspects. But again, it's give and take. There are brands that do their own thing. They do what they're good at versus other brands. But like I said earlier, it all depends on the technology in the cameras themselves. So you'll still have to compare different cameras to each other individually. For example, if you have a Canon camera that is 20 megapixels and a Sony camera that's 30 megapixels, for example. So with the rules that I stated, the Canon should have better low light performance, but these two cameras might have different technology within them. So even that Sony camera with 30 megapixels might still have better high ISO performance than the Canon with 20 megapixels. And even within the same brands, for example, if we bring back that Canon with 20 megapixels and they release a new camera with 30 megapixels, that 30 megapixel camera, because it has maybe a new processor, it has a new sensor, it might perform better than that lower megapixel Canon within the same brand. So you have to still compare these cameras to each other to figure out which one's the best one for you. Now, one thing I want to touch on quickly is sensor size. You're going to hear a lot about crop censored cameras, full frame censored cameras, medium format cameras. You're going to hear about all these different things, and you guys might not know what the differences are. But essentially, with cameras, you have your image sensor that captures the image, and those can be different sizes depending on what camera you're using. For example, your smartphone uses an image sensor to capture photos. And that's the same with your point and shoots, with your DSLRs, and that goes up to the medium format cameras. So these all have image sensors, but they're all going to be different sizes. Now, one general rule is performance increases as the size of the sensor increases. Again, given that the technology within these cameras are the same. For example, if your smartphone has the same kind of technology as a DSLR, but the DSLR has a much larger sensor, the DSLR is going to perform better. And the benefit in performance really comes in the high ISO performance as well as the dynamic range. So you're going to be taking better photos with low light, in low light situations with larger sensors, and you're going to get more detail in both your highlights and your shadows. In terms of sharpness, again, that comes down to the megapixels, but those two things hand in hand, the dynamic range, the ISO performance, aid that megapixel count or that resolution count to make the image that it is. And up till recently, medium format cameras, which are larger than full frame cameras, have been not the best in terms of high ISO performance, but since the move from CCD sensors to CMOS sensors, you can now see that where you have these medium format cameras which are amazing in resolution, dynamic range, and also have amazing high ISO performance now. So that effect of having better performance as you increase in sensor size is true all throughout now. Most of you guys will be using crop censored cameras, APS-C size censored cameras, and that's a good balance between performance, they're really good these days, and price, because they're not as expensive as full frame cameras, but most of you guys won't need those full frame cameras anyway. So if we move past the image quality, there are other features that you might want to look at. And one of them is within autofocus. Autofocus is a very important topic. It's a very useful thing for a lot of photographers. And within autofocus, there are two things that I want to look at. One is the autofocus points. A lot of cameras will have different amount of autofocus points. The 6D that I use, that I've used for a long time, isn't the best with autofocus, having only 11 autofocus points and having them all pretty much bunched up in the middle. So that camera, it's decent, it's, you know, it's usable, but it's not the best. There are cameras with like 30, 40, 50, 60 autofocus points now that are nicely spread out. So this is something that you'll want to look at. With those autofocus points, there are also different types of autofocus points, and you really want the cross type autofocus points, which are sensitive on all planes and that are sensitive to a few stops of exposure, so that they're good in low light situations as well. They're good with not so contrasty stuff and contrasty stuff. There are things to look at in that department. With autofocus also comes autofocus speed, and again, this will vary from camera to camera. Most cameras today are pretty fast. This 6D that I have, that I'm using right now, actually, the middle focus point is pretty fast. The outside focus points aren't that fast. So you'll have to look at the camera that you're looking at, and if you guys are an events photographer, a sports photographer, something with a lot of moving stuff, then you'll require more on your autofocus to get the job done, to get that image that you're looking for. So you'll have to invest a little bit more in a camera that is more focused on that. There's some cameras that are really good at landscape shots, really good at studio situations where you might not necessarily have a fast moving subject when a lot of stuff is controlled. And there are other cameras that are built for more, you know, action, outdoor, spontaneous run and gun. When you need that autofocus, you need a lot of these different features that act quicker, and there might be a trade-off in terms of dynamic range or high ISO. There might be a lot of different things that would be trade-offs. So it's important to figure out what type of camera and what you're going to be using that camera that you want for. Now, there are a bunch more things that you can consider when buying a camera, but I've talked about really the important ones when it comes to image quality. That's your megapixels, your high ISO performance, your dynamic range, and then also your autofocus, which I think is very important. I think those are the most important ones, and I'm going to add in one more, and that's going to be your ergonomics, your handling, and the feel of the camera. So when I talk about ergonomics and handling, I'm really talking about the shape of the camera, the size of the camera, how the camera feels in your hand, the button layouts of the camera, whether there are a lot of buttons or the buttons are minimal. There are a lot of different camera manufacturers with different philosophies when it comes to building the actual camera, how a camera feels, how a camera operates, and depending on what type of photography you're doing, you might want to consider one camera over the other. A lot of DSLRs these days are built the same, but when you look at mirrorless cameras, you'll find that a lot of different manufacturers are playing around with button placement, dial placement. Fuji, for example, Fujifilm likes to have a lot of buttons and dials so that everything can be manually or externally operated versus using the menus to operate things, versus some cameras which rely on the menu to change a lot of the settings. I'm personally a fan of camera manufacturers that put a lot of buttons and dials and still give you those options to change things in the settings. That gives you the most options, and I do like having that tactile feel of changing things and having it stay in place and seeing what the settings are just by looking at the camera. If you're interested in maybe street photography, or you're taking pictures of maybe just your family and you want something light, compact, you might look into a mirrorless camera or even a point and shoot camera versus a big giant DSLR with interchangeable lenses. And if you guys need that versatility of having more lenses, you might want to choose a system that's a little bit more complete at the moment. DSLR systems, if you're a sports photographer, have lenses that go up to like 600 millimeters. So that's it, guys. Those are the main features and specs that you guys will want to take note of when you guys are looking at cameras. There's your resolution, your megapixel count, high ISO performance, dynamic range performance, autofocus points and autofocus speed, and which I think is very, very important, that is your ergonomics, your handling, your build, and that sort of stuff. That to me plays a large role in determining what cameras I look for. In fact, just to tell you guys straight up, most cameras these days are good in terms of resolution, high ISO performance. Dynamic range, there's still some variation, but most of them are good enough. So the thing that usually sways me is how a camera feels in my hand, as well as the autofocus performance and feel, because some cameras aren't as snappy as others. They're just a little bit sluggish in comparison. So those are the things that I like taking a note of. Everything beyond that, you guys will learn later on, or they're not necessarily important for everyone to know. So those are sort of the main things you guys want to look at. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to list all of the equipment that I'm going to be using in the Photography for Beginners series down below. You guys can check those out. It's going to have the camera that I'm using, actually a slightly better one, because the camera that I am going to use is actually an older camera which isn't for sale in most places, and I'm also going to have the lenses down below. The next video is going to be all about lenses for beginners, so stay tuned for that. Again, subscribe if you haven't yet. I'll see you guys in the next one. I hope you guys are enjoying this series. Give this video a thumbs up, and yeah, I'll see you later.